Good afternoon. My name is Robert Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the Society of Satellite Professionals International, as well as of the World Teleport Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Content Distribution Forum. We produce this every year, that is SSPI and WTA, with the participation, of course, of the National Association of Broadcasters. From Monday through Wednesday, we are presenting 12 panels on the technology and the business of content distribution, because increasingly what we do on the business side is being driven by what's happening on the technology side. And we do everything from traditional broadcasting to IPTV, the triple play to mobile video here. On Thursday, we'll then be on that screen playing back some of our most popular sessions from the first 3 days. I expect this to be one of them. The program is made possible by the sponsorship of leading companies in the business, including Intelsat, which is operator of the world's largest satellite fleet, Inmarsat, a global leader in mobile satellite services, Ambrado Systems, which offers video processing solutions for HD broadcast cameras, as well as tapeless studios, and Cisco Systems, provider of video, IPTV, cable, and content delivery solutions around the world. I'd also like to thank PSSI Global Services, for providing live and recorded video coverage of the forum. It's being streamed now. It will also be available on the websites of SSPI and WTA throughout the year. And you can visit PSSI Global here in the Central Hall at booths C6448. And finally, if you'd like any additional information about our associations, you'll find it in the literature stand at the back. So, let's get going here with the digital TV transition. Now what? Led by our moderator, Dom Stasi, who's the Chief Technology Officer of TVN Entertainment. Dom? By the way, do you want to be okay standing up? I can do this one. Let's stand up.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. I'll be your moderator, as Robert said, for this session, and actually what a session it is, entitled The Digital Transition, the Digital TV Transition, What Next? I think none of us really expected to be here reprising this very popular session from last year, but here we are nonetheless, and I'm delighted to be asked to do it again. Our panel will be discussing this, which really is the central theme of not only this convention, but this time in history and in the history of our industry. We're going to see a huge fundamental change that so far apparently has been going a bit smoother than anticipated. To do that, we've assembled an absolutely extraordinary panel representing broadcast television, cable television, and the ink-stained wretch in the middle, the press. But before we turn to the experts, and since I'm the only one with whose mic is live at the moment, I'm going to ask you to indulge me for a minute. I have some prepared remarks, and I want to set some context for the panel, if you will. Of course, there's no one in this audience whose life has not been greatly influenced by analog NTSC television, National Television Standards Committee. As for myself, both NTSC television and I were conceived in 1941, inflicted on an unsuspecting world in 1942, and after a pretty good run, we were both intending to retire in February of 2009. Needless to say, neither of us have. And frankly, that's quite okay with me, because analog television has entertained and informed, delighted and outraged us, and not incidentally fed and clothed most of our families for certainly my entire career. And certainly that goes for just about everyone in this building, and certainly everyone in this audience. I'm profoundly proud and delighted to have been part of it, and that I had an opportunity to, as have most of us, to build a really enjoyable career. How few industries can say that most of its members actually like what we do. We're one of the few. Our audiences may not like what we do, but we certainly do. For better or for worse, we've seen analog television over its 50-year, 60-year history, 65-year history, grow from an idea to the most powerful communication entity in the history of the world. For better or worse, analog television is today more powerful, and more influential than the printing press. Now, analog NTSC television and I may have come into the world at the same time, but the similarities end there because, unlike me, analog television has improved with age, adding color in 1953, multi-channel stereo sound in 84, videotape, comb filtering, CMX, chroma key, VITs and VERS and cable and teletext and captioning and on and on and on and on. The list is almost endless. The steady stream of enhancements to the original NTSC standard promulgated in 1941 and 42. But to the point, all of it, every single enhancement has been, by law, backward compatible to the original standard. Nothing could be added to the analog signal that would not play on the deployed base of receivers. But let's face it, we've wrung about as much out of analog NTSC as we can. However fondly we will see this, however fondly we will consider its passage, we've really gone to the limit now. And in a world of personal computers, high-definition television, 3D, video games, social networking, virtual reality, and digital cinema, like your moderator, NTSC analog television is starting to show its age. So on June 12th, we think that's all going to change, because for the first time in the history of our medium, a broadcast standard will be federally mandated and imposed whose coding and modulation scheme will not be directly reproducible on a television set designed in 1941 and built in 1942. With the postponement of the transition deadline, the public has become quite aware of the change. However, the concentration has been on the incompatibility of the home receiver. Little else has been the focus of media attention or public press attention. But the incompatibility of the new standard is system-wide. Every component in the production, distribution, and exhibition chain has been either impacted or in some cases completely obviated by the parameters of the new imposed standard by this mandate. The costs have been staggering, as have the technical challenges. This comes at a time when commercial revenue is off, and off-air viewership, actual off-air viewership estimated by the by the NAB has been only 14% of American households view standard definition content off the air. The global economy is in free fall. Add to this the issues of channel loading, propagation, multipath, coding and compression schema, as well as those of public awareness. And it seems astounding to me, anyway, that we'll even make the June 12th deadline. But of course, thanks to people like this, we will, and handily so. Now, last year we convened this very same panel, very same people. The focus then was on how things were proceeding and what we might expect in the upcoming year. Now, with the delay, and with many stations already having cut over, we can actually look back. We have a wealth of empirical evidence and can discuss not so much how the transition is going, but how has it gone so far. To do just that, as I say, we have three extraordinary panelists. I want to thank them, friends of mine all. They've all been at the center of this storm, and I'm absolutely delighted that they're here to share some of that experience and insight with us. This is one of the best lineups of the show, without question. As a firm believer in age before beauty, I will introduce John McCoskey. John is a very distinguished panelist, is the first ever Chief Technology Officer of the Public Broadcast System. He holds no fewer than 40 issued and published patents. He's the former Chief Technology Officer of Discovery Communications and came to the media from GTE SpaceNet and Communications Satellite Corporation. An alumnus of Johns Hopkins University, John has more degrees than a Las Vegas thermometer. We won't go into those. And to talk about, I think, as someone who has been practically, theoretically, and I'm sure emotionally involved in this transition and influencing it, he has a wealth of information that he will share with us. John McCoskey, my friend.
Thank you, Dom. And I think the age, is it age before age, too? Is that?
Age before age before beauty.
Right. Well, thanks for the chance to be here again. I never would have thought a year ago sitting on this panel that we would be talking about still going through the analog shutoff and the DTV transition. But I think the experience that we've had over that year has actually been a pretty good one. To give you a sense of, for public stations, what's happened over the last year and how the transition has worked for us, think about stations having, kind of having planned to do this shutoff for 10 years. So this is not something that was a last-minute thing for stations. The last-minute part of this was more about viewers and about getting people to understand what they had to do in their homes. And so for stations, this was actually a pretty straightforward change. And what we found is that of our stations, about 40% went ahead and shut off on February 17th. And the reason for that was really two primary reasons driving that. One was cost. We estimated that across public television stations to stay on from February 17th to June 12th would cost about $22 million. And that's primarily in power bills and antenna leases and just keeping the dual infrastructure up and running. So most of our stations, particularly smaller market stations, went ahead and shut off on February 17th. We have about 25% that are going to wait until June 12th, and those are largely large market stations, and the rest are kind of staged to shut down between now and June 12th. So the shutdown has actually worked pretty well. Stations, overall, we found that viewers were relatively well prepared. Our biggest concern was that elderly viewers, and PBS tends to skew older in our viewing demographics, were not going to be prepared, and we were pleasantly surprised to find out ourselves, and from what Nielsen found out, that the elderly viewers were more prepared than anybody else. This was something that they spent time on. There were outreach in communities, outreach by AARP, and elderly viewers really were not the place that we were having trouble reaching people about how to hook up converters and how to do the transition. What Nielsen found was that Hispanic households were particularly unready for the transition, and I think those numbers are still there today. So one of the things we're trying to do is outreach to specific demographic groups that are still affected by the shutdown and trying to reach them. So I guess in a nutshell, the issues that we found were really kind of around a few things. One is the biggest issue is probably antennas in the home. There was a lot of focus on converter boxes, not a lot of focus on antennas, and for a lot of home viewers, they had an old antenna that was probably a VHF antenna that's sitting in the attic or in the basement somewhere, and most viewers didn't understand that the difference between VHF and UHF, and that antennas were going to be a big issue. So we spent a lot of phone calls, and our station spent a lot of phone calls with viewers, kind of walking them through getting antennas hooked up and things working. And probably the other thing that has been a challenge and will continue to be a challenge is the fact that until everybody shuts off and stations rechannel their final broadcast locations or positions, people at homes have to rescan their set-tops and televisions, and that's something that you're probably starting to see some PSAs about, and there's been more outreach about go in and go ahead and rescan your receivers every week or so until we get through the transition. Because what we're finding is people will move a channel, if your viewers don't rescan, they've lost that channel off their lineup, and that's been an important thing. The one thing that is often overlooked is that the analog shutoff is not for all analog television broadcasts, and low power stations and translators are largely remaining analog. There's no requirement for them to go digital, and in public television stations alone we have about 900 translator stations. So these are in mountainous areas, they're reaching small communities, and most of them are staying analog. So there still is a viewer confusion about, am I really converting? Do I have a converter box that will handle both analog and digital? So, again, it comes back to communicating with viewers, getting people to understand what's going on, and that's where we've had the most success with our stations. So if I look at now that we are, on the cusp of being a digital end-to-end service, what I wanted to do is talk about, from a public television standpoint, what some of the challenges that we think we're going to see in that environment, and then also talk about some of the opportunities, because I think we see really both. The economy is slowing things down for everybody. I don't have to say that to anybody in this room. And so for us and our stations, they're really challenged by, they've spent a lot of money on digital infrastructure. A lot of it's reaching end of life, believe it or not. I mean, a lot of stations have been up for more than 5 years with their digital equipment. And so they're challenged by, having to go back to communities and do fundraising drives to try and get, another round of digital infrastructure, when from the average viewer they're thinking, well, digital just happened. Why do you need to do that again? So the economy is hurting us a little bit on that. We do have to wrap up the DTV transition. You know, we went into this not knowing whether it was going to be a Y2K or a Katrina, and the experience we've had, and I think the industry as a whole has had, it was a Y2K. I mean, the country was relatively ready for this. Yes, there will be some people that when the final analog signals go off won't be ready, but they'll catch up. The coupon program is catching up, so we're not too worried about that. We're more worried about, you know, what do you do with the analog junk? So there's an awful lot of analog gear out there that really needs to be recycled. It needs to be taken off antennas. And from our perspective, we think everybody's kind of forgotten about that. And so we think that there is a large issue with analog decommissioning and kind of junk removal that is going to cost a lot of money, and we're just not clear on where that money is going to come from. Probably the biggest issue that our stations are facing related to the digital transition, believe it or not, are aspect ratios. So when you think about what public television producers have done since they started doing HD production is they've used the full 16:9 canvas of an HD screen. And when you look at that and then you realize that, as Don pointed out, you know, 85% of viewers are not getting their television over the air, and a lot of them are getting it in SD over cable and satellite. You know, what do you do with that 16:9 image to show that, you know, in a way that's going to work well for consumers? And our commercial counterparts have really thought ahead, I think, better than public television did, and looked at doing 4:3 center cut safe production where you can trim off the sides of the picture and show a full screen on 4:3. Since our producers tend to use the full widescreen, we have to go into a letterbox mode, which a letterbox is okay. Most consumers are used to that. They're used to it with DVDs. But then when you take that and you overlay legacy 4:3 content in a letterbox, you get what we call the postage stamp, which is a small image with black bars on all four sides. And that's something that is really challenging for stations. It's something viewers are very unhappy about. And a year ago, our position was that this magical thing called AFD was going to take care of that. And as all of you that are close to this probably know, AFD is not quite there yet. So we think it ultimately is going to be the answer, but we think we're still a few months away from making that work. So then in terms of overall challenges, now that we're in this digital world, we look at scaling as probably the biggest issue. And not so much on the broadcast side. We're looking at ourselves more as a media business than a broadcast business. You know, yes, we do broadcast HD and we do broadcast SD, but we have 15 other places that we actually publish content to. It's online. It's things like Hulu and iTunes, and we have our own online services for video. And so we're seeing a broad base of these publishing outputs for our content that are really stressing our infrastructure, and it's stressing more of the IT infrastructure than it is the broadcast infrastructure, ironically. We also see that as kind of the place that we've got the biggest amount of growth. And to give you a data point, PBS, which has been pretty active in online services, we currently have two 1 gigabit pipes that leave our facility that are handling just the basic web page servicing. So not any of the rich content, no video, no high graphics, no flash, and we flatline two 1 gigabit pipes every day. So the amount of viewer activity we're seeing online is just staggering, and we're seeing year after year 20-25% growth rates. So for us, the scaling and how we grow into that while maintaining the broadcast business is really a challenge. And then if you look at the opportunities, we really see digital as a real groundbreaking opportunity for us. We are a digital plant from the point of submission of content, which today we still get from producers on videotape. We capture that into a file. We do all our manipulation in a file-based environment. We go back to a linear broadcast. It's still digital, but we broadcast a linear broadcast out to our stations, who generally will either capture that into another file on their sites or capture it onto videotape and then play it out later. We see two places happening very quickly where we're going to go to a file-based infrastructure all the way from producers to our stations and ultimately to viewers. We're working closely with our producers to actually submit content as files. So get away from videotape and actually essentially email us, HD content. And obviously they're big files and it's not really email. But, getting us content through traditional data pipes where we can start with a file and never work with tape again. The next thing we're doing is actually going to file-based distribution from PBS to stations. And so we are actually in alpha test with a number of our stations where we are going to take all of our content except the live content and actually ship files from our operation to station operations, and stations will actually assemble those into their lineups for air. So that multi-platform layered into that, you can see is we've built that infrastructure for broadcast, and we can do the same thing for publishing to iTunes, and we can do that for Hulu and our own websites. We have this vision of a common multi-platform underlying architecture that doesn't matter where the output is, whether it's HD for broadcast or whether it's a low rate stream that's going to go onto streaming onto a cell phone. It's all one infrastructure to us, and that is one of the most compelling things about the digital infrastructure, is that we can do all of those different things and adapt and change as viewers change. We're finding that we want to be where viewers are going to find us rather than telling viewers where to find us. And I think that's a fundamental shift. It used to be that we would put a signal somewhere and we would tell viewers, if you want to watch us, that's where to find us. And now we know viewers are going different places. We're going to put content out there because we know they're going to find it there. And that to me is a big difference in the way we're doing our business. So overall, the opportunities are there. Mobile is on the horizon for us. We think that's a big opportunity. We think moving into higher quality video is an interesting opportunity. Moving into lower quality video is an interesting opportunity. So it's really looking at that whole spectrum. And with that, I will pass it on.
Tough act to follow.
Thank you, John, very much.
Thanks, John.
Always a delight and a wealth of information. I'm going to ask you, please hold your questions till the end so that we can be certain to get everybody's comments in. And
Don.
yes, Mike is
Closer.
closer? Okay. Next, I'd like to introduce Leslie Ellis. Leslie, another friend of mine, is an independent technology analyst, columnist, and author. She writes the Translation Please column for Multichannel News and is technology analyst for communications engineering and design. The intent of Leslie's translation column is to demystify engineering terms for non-technical readers. No mean feat. I could use some of that myself. I read the column every week. She's been senior technology at both of those publications, CED and Multichannel News. And among her books is Definitive Broadband, a dictionary of broadband terms. Leslie began her journalism career in 1987, 5 years old, 6? Yes. So please welcome Leslie Ellis.
Thank you, Don. I'm going to talk about two things today. One is where the cable industry is now in working with the broadcasters for those that have already shifted over. And then, as the title says, what's happening next on the cable side. Because it turns out that cable has some transition things going on themselves. So I live in Denver. 3 of our stations converted over last week. How many are you in markets where you don't have to hear the annoying directions every single hour of how to get ready for the transition? Where you live, is it still? Are you off? Are you digital? Anybody? Just Denver? All right. Well, to get ready for this, I spoke with some of the cable engineering guys, and they're saying that as many as 45% already cut over between February and now. So they're looking at it as almost half done. One of them said of 500 stations that converted over on the 19th. They had four big problems related to transmit power levels, and that he thinks it's a non-event. So I think we're saying the same thing. I hope they're all right. But on the cable side, what's next in cable is kind of a similar transition, but for matters of bandwidth or shelf space. A few years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago, the operators all took everything on their analog shelf and made it available in standard definition digital. And then they also made it available in some cases in high definition digital. So if you're a cable operator, it's a very high chance that you're carrying several channels 3 different ways: analog, standard definition, and high definition. So it uses a lot of room. And it turns out that where John and the broadcasters have 1 6 megahertz channel, operators have about 150 that they fill, and about 75 of them are analog. So for them, even though they transitioned to analog, they didn't transition or transition to digital. They did not transition away from analog. So that's a long way of saying what's happening with broadcast is, you get the thing, it's cheap, you plug it into the back of your TV, and you can see TV. Well, in some cases, especially if you're a Comcast subscriber, what you'll start happening probably 6 months from now or in a year is they'll offer you this thing that's small, and it's about $50 that you don't have to pay, and you plug it into the TVs that are in the back of your house or in the kitchen that don't have a set-top box. The wire comes right out of the wall and into the back of the TV, and that TV will still work. So the only difference is they'll also give you a remote control. So if you're like me and your dog ate the remote that came with your TV a long time ago, and now you get your remote back. So why is that happening? Because they need more shelf space for some of the things that Steve is going to talk about. So in Comcast's case, they're hoping to be able to take back so right now, operators' plant is segmented between 54 and 550 megahertz. That whole chunk of space is analog. And then from 550 to 750 or 860, depending on how far they went, is digital. So what Comcast wants to do is take back between 45 and 60 megahertz, which is enough channels that's like 90 to 120 more linear HD channels that they could carry. Or, they could do what Steve's going to talk about, channel bonding to give super fast internet speeds, 160 megabits down kind of speeds. So even though cable already transitioned to digital, I think the next transition you'll see for them is to start removing their analog or putting that analog spectral shelf space to alternate use. I told you I didn't have 10 minutes.
You mentioned last night, Leslie, something at dinner. You mentioned something that intrigued me. I think the term you used was analog harvesting.
Right. So that's that's what even Comcast calls what it's doing is they're harvesting their analog bandwidth for digital purposes. So when they give you this digital thing for the TVs in your house where the plug comes right out of the wall into the back of your set, now you're an all digital household, and you're also you're capable of getting everything in digital. So they're harvesting their analog to give you more digital stuff.
Okay, well, thank you. Needless to say, this is not only a complex undertaking technologically and from a business point of view, but the regulatory morass. Admittedly, I'm an easily confused person, but very few things have confused me to the extent that the regulations surrounding the DTV transition, particularly as they affect alternate carriers, well, I use the term alternate carriers, even though the vast majority of us receive our signals by way of satellite or IPTV or cable. There have been a number of regulations that were not clear to me, and I think now with another year to look back on them, things like dual must carry, transmission reconsent, the ability or not to downrate digital content to make bandwidth room and so on have, to my way of thinking, not been terribly clear to me as a sort of an ancillary observer. Part of what I hope Steve is going to discuss has to do with that. And Steve Mace, to my immediate right. Steve is Senior Director of Systems Technology in the Science and Technology Department of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, NCTA. NCTA is the cable telecommunications equivalent of the NAB. Steve provides technical support for the association's efforts in industry techno-policy, as well as analysis and evaluation of the technical issues being considered by public policymakers in Washington. Steve has been in the telecom industry for 20 years and holds a master's in interdisciplinary communications. Steve Mace, please welcome Steve Mace.
Thank you, Dom. Since Dom set me up for this,
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm going to answer his questions about technology policy first, and then I'm going to go into a little bit about what we did to make this transition successful, what we're still doing in an ongoing manner to make it successful through June 12th, and then a little bit about what that means for the industry, for the cable industry, because there are some implications for us, even though this was really a broadcast transition, not a cable transition, and we just accommodated it because we needed to. And we had to, because our customers get these channels and we want them to continue to get them in a seamless fashion. So anyway, to go over the first few policy issues, to get those out of the way, dual must carry. It's been resolved. There you go. And the answer is that the cable industry last summer, working with the FCC, we wanted to come up with a solution that we could agree to, and that the FCC would think was agreeable as well, and that we could stick to through a certain time period in order to accommodate our customers that have cable-ready set-top or cable-ready televisions that don't have a set-top box. In other words, if we weren't going to dual must-carry, if we just carried the digital signal, we'd have a large number of customers, probably 40%, that wouldn't get the broadcast signals because they have analog TVs plugged directly into the cable. So we've agreed jointly with the FCC to dual must-carry analog and digital channels for 3 years, and then after the period of 3 years, we'll take a look at it again and see where we are in our digital migration. Certainly, there will be certain cable companies that will be all digital by then, or already are, and they don't have that obligation. But we made a commitment to do that. So that's where that stands. But if you have any questions during this, Dom, let me know. In the area of multicast, what that means is, when broadcasters go digital, they can have a primary signal and they can have additional secondary signals that have other channels, which they already do that. The FCC found that requiring us to carry anything but the primary signal was unconstitutional, and therefore, we don't have to do it. But quite frankly, if there's a compelling channel, a secondary channel that an operator creates, of course we'd carry it. I mean, if the next Sesame Street came out on channel 2.1, we'd be crazy not to carry that. So I think the reality is we're going to carry the primary signal as we're required to, and if there's great compelling content that comes out that's been created, then I'm sure through some negotiation we'd carry that as well, but we're not required to. The third thing was that came up at the FCC was, the broadcasters wanted us to carry all the bits. In other words, if there was a 19.4 megabit high definition signal, that we'd be obligated to carry all 19.4 megabits. How that came out is it's really a business negotiation between the cable operator and the broadcaster. If it's a retransmission consent deal, it's a business decision between the two. If it's a must-carry station, then we still have, and we can take it on ourselves to determine the quality of the signal, and as long as it's not materially degraded, it's hard to say, then we're within our rights to do so. So that's where those came out. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. Okay, let me get on to a little bit more about the DTV transition more directly. Currently, as of today, 708 of 1,078 stations have already migrated. So there's 368, I guess it is, that have not. So we're still dealing with those stations. Quite frankly, the cable industry, my guess is, has already completely prepared for those when they transition. We will have to do some things for people, for stations that flash cut. We'll have to be prepared for those situations. But a lot of these stations are carried on fiber. A lot of these stations we already have the digital feed for. So that's just a matter of us, carrying in digital. And when they cut off their analog, we're already in digital anyway. So there are really two transitions in our mind. There's the broadcast DTV transition, which is what we're talking about today, and there's cable's own digital transition, which means migrating from a platform that's partly analog, partly digital, to fully digital. We've been working with the broadcasters for almost 2 years now to get ready for the February 17th date that now is the June 12th date. Some of the activities we were doing in regards to making sure that worked out well for both sides. Since mid-2007, we've been working with MSTV, NAB, and the ACA. We've developed joint operational and technical checklists, which we've shared between the two parties and collaborated on. We've had approximately 10 joint planning meetings across the United States where MSTV and NCTA and ACA have got together, went to various geographical locations, got the broadcasters and local cable operators together and shared those checklists and shared operational planning details, and just met face to face to make sure that both parties knew what the other side had to do technically and operationally. We've had weekly calls for over a year with MSTV, NAB, ACA, and NCCC, just to make sure that if any issues needed elevated to the national level, that we'd have a platform for that. We've tracked the progress of our cable companies towards some set goals that we've all agreed on and a set of metrics. We've had an education program to go to what was talked about earlier for our customers as well as broadcast customers. We've developed over $200 million worth of PSAs. We've targeted ads toward the Hispanic community. We've had content experts on news and radio programs, town meetings, press conferences, and we were founders, along with NAB and MSTV, of the DTV Coalition. So, after all that was said and done, what did that mean for us? Well, during the period of the transition itself, February 17th, a few days before and a few days after, we developed a joint call center with the FCC of about 5,000 CSRs and fielded calls as people went through the transition. If they had questions about their converter box, if they had questions about, what do I do? I'm a cable subscriber. What do I do? I'm not. We fielded those calls, and we also had a IVR set up that actually handled about 75% of the call volume. We set up a war room for the evening of the 17th. The bad news about the war room is I got to stay up all night. The good news is we didn't get a single call, and that war room was actually created for our operators to call in if they had an issue that they thought might impact other cable operators, so that we could have a way to get the information out. So that was extremely successful, and like Leslie said, we've had just a handful of issues. So anyway, after that's all said and done, and after June 12th occurs, our industry wants to migrate to a fully digital platform, and we're going through that right now. And we want to do that because we need to reclaim that bandwidth for high-speed data and interactive applications, but not just for data to the home for your standard internet service, but for applications based on a requirement for high-speed data, such as telehealth, telework, things of that nature. And we're doing that right now. 60% of our subscribers right now are digital, and that's ramping up. A couple examples: Cablevision in New York is already 90% digital, and they expect to be 100% by the end of this year. Ben Broadband, I just got an email from the CEO of Ben Broadband right before this panel. I jotted down some notes because I knew that they were going in that direction, and they are already 100% digital as of January 2nd. Through the reclamation of that bandwidth, they were able to, the bandwidth that they reclaimed was 300 megahertz of spectrum. They doubled their high-speed data service. They have 77 high-def channels. They have a selection of 2 interactive program guides, and they took them about 2 years to do that. So that's one real-world example of what we're doing with this in this program. Some of the things we want to do with this reclaimed bandwidth is we want to use it for true two-way applications, which is our interactive TV platform. We want to deploy more DOCSIS 3.0, so we can get upwards of 100 megabits per second data speeds. We want to continue to deploy digital voice. Right now, Comcast is the 3rd largest telephone provider in the United States. I mentioned services like telehealth, online learning, video teleconferencing, energy management. Those are the areas we're looking to get into. Also, WiMAX. Right now, Comcast is working with Clearwire in Portland to rebrand Clearwire's WiMAX service and roll out cable in a way that will cover the entire city, so that you can extend your home service to anywhere within the Portland area. So I guess that's a lot said in a few minutes. So Dom, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Steve. Are you going to do another war room on June 12th?
We don't know if there's a need, but we're looking at it. So
it's interesting you mentioned Cablevision and Bend. I guess it's Bend, Oregon broadband. We're among the first to go all digital. My network is a VOD network, video on demand, and the same 2 cable systems, same 2 operators were the first to adopt video on demand. So they're apparently very forward thinking. And anyway, thank you, panel. I know that if there are any questions that you have about digital television and the transition, certainly this panel is the opportunity to get them answered. I can't imagine anything that this cross-section of experts can't address. But just to kick things off, now I live in Studio City, California. It's a section of LA that is clearly the media-intensive company town in a company city. Everybody in Studio City is in the media business. Everybody's in television, radio, or movies. And there isn't an antenna to be seen. There's lots of home theaters and all sorts of things, but with the exception of my neighbor across the street, who was a film editor, a major feature film editor, he doesn't have cable or IPTV or satellite. He just gets his signals off the air. So he's been asking me a great deal about the DTV transition, and he's not a snob. He says, if I had cable, I would never leave the living room. I would not go to work. I would not go to sleep. I would just watch television. So he recently got a DTV box, and he came over and he said, I haven't been to work in a week. I haven't slept. And all I'm doing is watching, because he was surprised at how many new channels appeared as part of the channel loading. If I'm not mistaken, I'll throw this question out. I believe the digital standard, the 8VSB standard over the air, will provide about 19.4 megabits of throughput. That is one high-definition channel, or a high-def channel, and perhaps a couple of standard definition. What kind of channel loading are we anticipating, or what are the stations, your member stations perhaps? Or
for us, it's all over the map, and I think public television stations tend to do more multicasting than commercial stations do. Ours, probably the average for us is one HD channel and two SD channels, and then we have extreme cases. You know, we have one station that does one kind of compressed HD channel and 7 SD channels. And the reason they do it is they're a small station in a very rural environment. They produce news shows, 6 days a week. They're really the television that's available to a lot of viewers, and they deliberately sacrifice quality to deliver more services to those viewers. So for us, it is all over the map. And I think for stations today, the thing that they're most interested in is as they look at the mobile opportunity. They're really looking at, okay, what are we going to trade to be able to get mobile services? And kind of the thinking now is it's probably trade one of those SD channels for 2 mobile channels of reasonable quality. Although I will tell you that there have been discussions with some stations, particularly in major markets, that realize, what Dom had said, that very few viewers are getting over-the-air broadcast television. So they are thinking about taking their HD completely off of broadcast, delivering their HD by fiber to cable head ends and to DBS, and recovering the broadcast spectrum. Keep a Lifeline standard def channel, but recover the other channels for things like mobile. So,
thank you. Well, we have about 10 or 15 minutes left, so I'm going to throw it open to the audience, please. And there's a mic coming. Thanks.
I want to respond to what you had said earlier about the low-power stations that would stay analog. Well, I work for one of those. I work at a community college, and so right now we're still running. We have 3 servers who are getting our station out to a pretty wide spread in suburban Chicago area. But we're here to figure out this exact thing: is what would we benefit if we were to go back and really suggest and say, hey, look, we really want to broadcast digital. I understand that there's more space and it's more efficient, but in your opinion, is this a practical move for us to try to pursue? And I wouldn't even know the beginning of the cost, and just to kind of let you know a little bit more about where we're at. We also have 2 big satellite dishes, and we're just still wondering what can we do with that, because right now it's looking like they're obsolete.
COD by any chance?
No, Waubonsee Community College, Sugar Grove.
I'm sorry.
Anyone from Illinois?
Do people live there, or is it a commuter college? So there's not a lot of TV spigots that you have to connect to somebody's HD, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that one of the approaches to translator stations is there's been federal money has gone into, particularly for rural stations, in providing low-cost digital to analog converters on the order of $1,000, and there are grants available to both non-commercial and commercial licensees. And I think that is going to delay the transition to digital, and I think that's unfortunate, because I think when you look at, if you extend a digital signal through a translator. You bring in HD, you bring in multicast, standard def channels. You have the opportunity to bring in data casting, which we look at as data casting as good opportunities for things like public safety, and tying into community services like that. So I don't know the costs, but I think you're going to see those costs come down dramatically. I mean, it really is not a hard translation to make. It's just there hasn't been a lot of focus on it. I think it's just been kind of in the background. And I think as you look at it, and as you look at the advanced services you can get from going digital on a translator, I think you'll see that it's a compelling way to go.
I have a comment, even though it's not really related to cable, but I was just thinking about your question. And since you're a low-power station, and assuming that you'll maintain those power levels, even if you go digital, one of the things that, and you said you're near Chicago, so it's an urban area, then. Even with the regular Class A stations and regular high power stations, when you go to digital, the radiation pattern of and the way that that reception works changes a little bit. There's this thing called the analog cliff, and so basically with an analog transmitter, as you get further and further away from the antenna, it degrades gracefully, and then it gets snowier and snowier and snowier. Then pretty soon it's not an acceptable picture. With digital, you go further away from it, and all of a sudden you have nothing. It's all or nothing. And even folks that are transitioning today are having a problem in various markets. Some of the customers that used to get a particular station just can't receive it anymore. And maybe if they put a rooftop antenna up, they'd be able to. But there are technical issues with going to digital that may or may not be conducive to your particular situation. I don't know. So.
Our Denver just went through that, and if they keep saying rescan it, just rescan it, like they say it all the time.
Yeah, the rescanning is one issue, but the other issue is that the early converter boxes, in particular, a number of them did not have an analog pass-through. So any channels that were analog are going to get blocked by the box, and you're not going to get them. And that's something they figured out later, but wait till they switch over or go with most of the converters that have been built in the last few months or 6 months even. There's actually a notation on the converters now. Do they do analog pass through or not? Because it was an issue that nobody thought about ahead of time, and they experienced it in the field.
As we discuss propagation and issues of threshold and so on, I'm going to ask the question I ask all the time. Has the I'm going to put this in quotation marks, the debate, as it were, over co-FDM versus 8VSB, and a lot of the iconoclasts are saying 8VSB was the wrong decision and the propagation issues. Has that gone away?
I think you're being we call that the religious war.
Okay.
I actually think it has. I mean, I think you still have people that are on one side or the other of that, but they realize the standard has been in place. All the gear has been deployed. We are where we are, and I don't think anybody's looking about going back.
Yes, microphone. Randy, you got a mic?
A question for John. The digital transition is really about getting the signal to the home, but you talked about going file-based and going digital all through the value chain, from the producers just delivering programs in file form and file delivery to your affiliates and so on. My question is this: did the digital transition itself influence specifically your decisions up the value chain, or would you have done all of those things anyway, going digital farther up the chain?
We would have done it anyway. I mean, the goal there was to get away from the inefficiencies and quality issues with tape, and to get to a more automated workflow. So for us, going digital was more about automating things and being able to build a workflow where frankly, you don't want people to do anything unless the decision has to be made, or there's something falls off the normal path. And I think, Dom, you guys on the VOD world have done the same thing. It's really, that workflow is just more amenable to doing more with less labor and infrastructure.
To that end, and yes, in the file-based world, we did that. But being a linear station, prior to that, running 40 channels of linear, albeit digital content, we had gone through a very serious retooling of our facility to handle serial digital video, and the SMPTE standards, and the plant was reconfigured to be complete SDI, SMPTE compatible. And then we started getting involved with MPEG-2 and MPEG-4 file-based content. It made it so much easier. We just developed a whole automation system to handle that. And I think that's probably been an interesting, albeit probably reluctant transition that you've seen here on the show floor as well as in physical plant. Greg.
Hi, a question for Steve. Steve, with the change of the transition date to June 12, did that extend or reset the date, the 3-year timeline for cable and I think satellite also, to have to carry local full power in analog? And could you just restate that rule?
I'm not sure, but I think it did. I haven't talked to our legal department about that. It's a good question. I thought about it this morning. I thought it might be asked, but I'm not sure what the answer is. But I believe that would be the case. I think that the assumption would be that that's the track we would take, just because it is reasonable. But did you want me to restate what the? Yeah. What we agreed to with the FCC last summer is that for 3 years, at the end of the transition, so I think that means it would be June 12th, that we'll continue to carry on cable systems that are not all digital yet. All must-carry stations in both analog and digital format, so as not to strand our subscribers that have cable-ready TVs, as opposed to digital set-top boxes. Or maybe they'll have a second TV, and in their bedroom that's a cable-ready TV without a box. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Also, somewhat of a legal question. As we move to these other distribution platforms, albeit mobile, whatever, are there particular content rights issues that must be addressed, and how are they being addressed?
I can even answer yes. There are myriad content rights issues. Is anybody prepared to answer that?
I can agree with Dom that yes, there are issues. As we start doing these things, generally we're working under experimental rights. So we generally have the ability to try things out, and frankly, our content owners and producers are really interested in experimenting too, because there's some things that are going to have a lot of value to the community as a whole, and other things that aren't. So as we look forward, and the rights that we look for today, you might expect are very different than the rights we looked for 5 or 10 years ago, just because you have different options out there, different ideas on the table. So. It's a constant discussion. It involves, the guilds and lots of players that want a piece of anything that's successful.
Yeah, my company handles about 8,000 hours a month of content from over 200 sources, all of the majors. Being a Hollywood company, of course, the studio guys are always wandering in to see how we're doing our encoding, what sort of unannounced, what sort of encryption are you, and having made everyone comfortable, and we as many content providers walk a tightrope between the content producers wanting their art reproduced absolutely faithfully, and the bandwidth owners, cable operators, broadcasters, telcos, satellite, are less interested in quality. Not to say they're not, but they're more interested in more bang for the buck. Quantity, how many channels can I squeeze in there? And rights are associated not only with that, with release windows. We're starting to see for the first time, the movie Twilight, for example, was the first movie, I think it was 2 weekends ago, major feature film, was the first movie that came out on the same day in theatrical exhibition, DVD, and video on demand. That was a big first. And they were the first one in history to take that chance. The rights issues around that were extraordinary, particularly because when you put something on satellite, for example, it's there for the entire continent to see if they can decrypt it. So watermarking, and the studios are very concerned about all of that. And on the other end, the distributors are very concerned about, well, what is a watermarking receiver going to cost me in the set-top box, and so on and so forth. So the rights issues have been associated with the longer the delay window, in other words, the longer the period from initial release, whether it's first run TV or theatrical release, to the release on that platform, are going to be consistent with how stringent the rights imposition is. You're going to have watermarking, forensics, encryption, blah, 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 blah. So now we're looking at perhaps one feature film that might have 5 different release windows. Theatrical, airline and DVD, cable, subscription, video on demand, broadcast, and finally free to the $2 bin in the video store. So the rights issues are becoming more complex than the imposition of technology itself. Yeah. And I think that's not going to change. Yes.
Do you think WiMAX is going to become the eventual carrier of mobile TV, or it's just going to be a partial solution?
I don't know the answer, but I would say probably not, just because the major telcos are pursuing a different method called LTE, and since they are mobile to begin with, and that's their advancement, I think that's the way it'll go. Whereas on the cable side, the cable operators are the big ones have just formed a JV with Sprint and Clearwire and Google to build a national broadband wireless network, but I'm not sure where they're going to go with their voice over IP.
I never make predictions because I recall back in 1980 I was working for Home Box Office, and a new company was forming across the street on Rockefeller Center. And the president of that company, I was director of engineering at HBO, the president of that company invited me to lunch in the Warner Brothers executive dining room. So I was very impressed. And I wasn't looking for a job. I was perfectly happy. And he was explaining to me this new concept that they were coming out with. And it had to do with playing music videos 24 hours a day. But of course, we were talking about MTV. Well, I had finished lunch and had my drink, and I was very relaxed and comfortable now and ready to go back to work. And he says, well, what do you think? I said, I think that's the dumbest damn thing I ever heard. So, the most successful single network launch in history. So I will refrain from postulating on.
I was just going to mention, I just looked over there, and there's a sign that says ATSC Mobile DTV Pavilion. So maybe that's a place we can all go visit after here to get up to date on what's the latest and greatest.
Well, we have time for one more. I'm going to throw one out there. We've talked a great deal about quality and coding and so on. One of the major inspirations and philosophies behind going digital, particularly for television, for video, has been, any of us who've ever worked as an editor know that you're always trying to get as few generations to the release print as possible. And often we work right on the master, cut on the master, do those kinds of dangerous things to prevent the analog degradation, the imposition of random noise in the content. But digital has freed us from that. You can make 1,000 generations of a digital content piece, and it will be identical to the master. At least so we thought, and that was before compression. With the advent of compression, and with bandwidth being the grail, the most expensive part of the chain, we're starting to see on all fronts. You might have a 19.4 megabit, let's call it information rate on a 6 megahertz channel, but cable operators will chop that up and downrate the video. Telcos will do it. In fact, the broadcasters will do it to get more and more content. So we're starting to see marginal content coming out of the chute to begin with, and it sort of negates or obviates the digital advantage. Is that something that we're attending to? Is there a minimum standard, for example, that will compete in a world that's going to see not only YouTube but Blu-ray?
We're certainly not seeing that. I mean, I think when you look at our food chain, we start out at 145 megabits, and a lot of times it ends up in a living room at 10 or 12 megabits. So going through, maybe 4 codec cycles. So
3.75 megabits on cable.
yeah, I'm talking HD.
Oh.
But so what's interesting is I think that viewers become more and more aware. But there's a great statistic, and this is probably about 3 years old, that 70% of people that bought an HD television set took it home, hooked it up. They never bought an HD service from cable. They weren't watching HD over the air, but they had an HD television set and it had a widescreen, and they were very happy with it. And so I think, since that time, I think the numbers are down in the 30 or 40%, but it's still a large number of people that think they have HD and don't. But viewers are becoming more and more interested and becoming more and more aware. I think, in certain environments, we're going to see a recognition that quality is important. But interestingly, what we're hearing from viewers is they're much more interested in audio than they are video. So lip sync is an issue that is, I think, plaguing the industry. Viewers are very sensitive to lip sync issues. They're very sensitive to stereo and 5.1 and switching back and forth, and seem less concerned and interested today, at least, about the normal kind of codec artifacts that you see in compressing video. So that's my feeling.
Yeah, I just want to say that, look, we've got competitors out there today we never had before. We've got, when I joined the NCTA 7 years ago, we had DBS and we had cable, and we had over-the-air. Now we've got over-the-air HD, which looks fantastic. We've got DBS delivered HD. We've got FiOS HD. We've got AT&T UVerse. We have over-the-top video, and we have every, incentive to not want to degrade the quality of our HD programming to be less than excellent compared to with our, those other people I just mentioned. So, through statistical multiplexing and really advanced codecs and the new technology, I don't believe that our HD looks any different or any worse than any of our competitors. If I go home tonight, I know when I turn on my TV and watch Jay Leno or whoever's on the Tonight Show now, it looks brilliant. It just looks fantastic. I have a brand new 1080p television, and it looks great. And so I don't believe that there's an issue there. I think if you go on like AVS Forum and guys that go out there that are techno geeks and put some test gear on their box and they say, oh, well, we've got this compression rate and this compression rate, this one's clearly better. Put them in a room and tell them, you're the golden eye guy, and tell me the difference between these technologies or these delivery methods, and they're going to fail. So, even though there are issues out there and people know about them, we've got to do what we can to maximize our bandwidth, and that's what we do. And delivering the best content we can and the most content we can is important to us, and I think we're going to compete there. And if we're not competing there, then we're going to change our ways. So that's how I feel about it.
Oh, I would say there are those who would say, and I'm talking about Bob Zitter from HBO, who was on this panel the last couple of years. He pointed out earlier this year that if you've seen the difference between DVD and Blu-ray DVD, that's an indicator of the difference between the HD sets that are out now and the 1080p's that are entering the market now. So his position is that this will be the first time that the display itself can show more picture information than can be sent to it. So that's very different for the last 60 years of cable sending bits over the wire or sine waves over the wire to get picture information to the screen. It used to be that the cables would send more than could be displayed. Now it's the display technologies are outpacing what can connect into it.
720p. I'm sorry. 720 by 480 comes out of the camera, and if you've ever seen studio quality analog television, it's exquisite. But a television receiver, most receivers can't resolve more than 400 lines. So, but in the high definition world, 1080p, 1920 by 1080 is exactly that, and that's not always what's getting to the set. So, for the first time, the reception device is the superior piece in the chain. We're out of time. We're about 5 minutes over. Thank you all, and I want to thank the panel for what I thought was a very robust session. Thank you all very much.
I'm starving. It's not till
Thanks
like
again,
5.
Steve, on the last minute.
Sure.
It's fun.